Charleston, in the year 1775, is a city that shines like a jewel and rots like a wound at the same time. What you're about to see has been buried under centuries of paint and politeness, but AI reconstruction lets us walk these streets again, exactly as they were. A southern port where elegance and brutality walk the same cobblestone streets without ever looking each other in the eye. From a distance, the harbor glitters, tall masted ships at anchor, rows of fine houses facing the water, church spires rising above the humid haze. Up close, the air is thick with tar, sweat, rum, and the iron smell of chains. Behind every polished front door and every carved balcony lies a question that no one can escape much longer. How long can this beautiful city stay loyal to a distant king while its foundations shake? The first thing that grabs you is the harbor. Watch carefully, because what you see from the water is not what you'll find when you step onto the docks. If you arrive by ship, Charleston appears as a long crescent of wharves and warehouses curving along the Cooper River, backed by elegant brick townhouses and crowded alleys. Sailors shout in half a dozen languages, from English and Scots to French and Portuguese. Dock workers roll barrels, haul bales of rice and indigo, and guide horses pulling loaded carts toward the counting houses. On the upper floors, merchants watch from open windows, quills in hand, calculating profits and risks. They read letters about taxes, blockades, and skirmishes far to the north, and they know that every crate unloaded on this wharf may become more dangerous than valuable. But the real power in this city isn't on the docks, it's hidden behind mansion doors. Let me show you. Walk inland from the water, and the city changes block by block. Along East Bay Street, the richest men in the colony build houses that are half palace, half fortress. Wide porches to catch the breeze, tall windows, imported china on the tables, and Caribbean mahogany in the floors. In the drawing rooms, ladies in silk gowns and powdered hair discuss fashion from London and gossip from the Caribbean, while their husbands argue in lower voices about Parliament, trade restrictions, and the possibility of war. They are loyal British subjects, they insist, but they are also businessmen watching an empire gamble with their fortunes. The tension is like the summer heat, ever present, pressing on every conversation. And here's the question no one in these parlors will say out loud: where does all this wealth actually come from? Follow the smell of sweat and animals, and you reach a different part of the harbor, the slave market and the holding yards. This is the part of Charleston that tourists today don't see in the brochures, but in 1775 it was impossible to ignore. Here there are no chandeliers, only rough wooden pens and packed earth worn hard by thousands of footsteps. Men, women, and children stand under the sun, some newly arrived from ships, others born on nearby plantations and brought here to be sold again. Auctioneers call out prices and qualities as if they are describing livestock. Buyers test teeth, muscles, and scars with cold efficiency. The whole economy of the city, its rice fields, its indigo vats, its fine houses and imported tea, rests on the unwilling labor of the people standing in chains. Charleston's elegance is financed by this violence, and everyone in the city knows it, even if they try not to see. So when the churches start ringing their bells, calling everyone to prayer, what do you think those sermons sound like? Above this world of trade and suffering rise the churches. The tall steeple of St. Michael's stands out against the sky, a landmark for sailors and a reminder that the city thinks of itself as respectable and fear-giving. On Sundays, bells ring out over rooftops, calling white Charlestonians to polished pews, while many enslaved people worship in whispered gatherings in kitchens, yards, and the edges of fields. In the Anglican sermons, ministers speak of order, loyalty, and obedience to the king, as if political stability could be guaranteed from the pulpit. But outside, pamphlets circulate that quote very different texts: Locke, Montesquieu, and the language of natural rights. Inside the church, everyone bows, kneels, and repeats the same prayers. Outside, people wonder how a city built on bondage can talk about liberty without choking on the word. And that contradiction, it's about to explode. But first, let's go beyond the city walls. Move toward the edges of town, and the landscape opens up into rivers, marshes, and plantations. This is where Charleston's real money is made, and where the word freedom means something completely different depending on who's speaking. Charleston's wealth does not come from the city alone, but from miles of rice fields stretching along the tidal waterways. At the big plantation houses, owners ride out to inspect embankments and floodgates, worrying about storms, pests, and the price of rice in London. In the fields, enslaved Africans and African Americans work in brutal humidity, using knowledge of water, soil, and crops that their owners rely on but do not fully understand. Many speak Gullah, a language woven from African and English threads, and share stories and songs that keep memories alive across the ocean. When the news of rebellion and war travels upriver, it does not sound the same to them as it does in the townhouse parlors. The meaning of freedom is far more literal and immediate. Now, back in the city streets at night, something is shifting. Pay attention. Charleston streets are a map of class and race. On one corner, a tavern is loud with British officers in crisp uniforms, laughing too loudly and drinking imported spirits paid for by the colonial government. On another, artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, sailmakers argue about politics over cheap beer. In back alleys, free black people and mixed-race craftsmen navigate a dangerous middle ground, controlled by laws, watched with suspicion, yet needed for their skills. At night, patrols move through the streets, checking passes and enforcing curfews on the enslaved. Every lantern-lit crossing, every creak of a door carries questions. Who belongs here? Who is in control? And what will happen when that control cracks? And at the edge of the harbor, the forts are watching. But are they watching for enemies outside or inside? At the harbor's entrance, forts guard the channel. The British flag still snaps in the sea wind over brick walls and cannon embrasures. Soldiers drill in neat lines, their muskets flashing in the sun, while officers talk about Boston, Lexington, and Concord, as if those distant names are warning buoys. Everyone understands that Charleston is too important to remain quiet for long. It is a rich prize, a strategic port, and a symbol of royal power in the South. Rumors say that ships full of troops may arrive, or that the city's own militia may one day turn their guns around. The forts do not yet know which direction the next war will face, out toward foreign enemies or inward toward their own restive neighbors. Meanwhile, in the markets and meeting halls, the city is trying to pretend everything is normal. But is it? For now, the city tries to continue as usual. The markets open each morning, carts rattle over uneven stones, and vendors call out prices for fish, vegetables, and cloth. Children play in courtyards, dodging servants and tradesmen. But the conversations under the surface keep circling back to the same points: taxes, blockades, boycotts, loyalty, honor, property. Planters and merchants gather in secret or semi-secret meetings, debating whether petitions and polite protests have any effect on a parliament that sees them as distant troublemakers. Some argue for patience and negotiation. Others whisper about resistance, alliances with northern colonies, and the possibility, still shocking to many, of complete independence. Now, back in the city streets at night, something is shifting. Pay attention. Your eye can travel from the harbor's glittering water to the slave pens, from the governor's house to the poorest yards, from the church steeples to the silhouettes of forts on the horizon. Everywhere the same pattern repeats: polished surfaces and hidden fractures. Charleston in 1775 is both loyal and rebellious, refined and brutal, prosperous and terrified. It is a city where people dance at balls while writing letters about war, where they quote the language of liberty while living in a system built on bondage. Standing in the middle of this city, you cannot yet see the sieges and battles that will come, the desperate defenses and the eventual surrender, the fires and occupations that will scar Charleston. You cannot see the long future in which the city will try to market its beauty without fully facing its past. But you can feel that something enormous is approaching. The harbor wind smells of salt and wood smoke, but beneath it there is another scent, the ozone edge of a coming storm. Charleston in 1775 is not yet the battlefield that history books remember, but it is already the fuse, burning slowly toward an explosion that will redraw the map of an empire and force everyone in the city to choose which side of its own contradictions they will stand on. Thanks for watching our AI reconstruction of Charleston 1775. Subscribe to see more cities brought back to life.